I just want to acknowledge that I'm being assisted, and I really need it, by colleague Lavina Murray from the JCTS office. So a big shout out to her. And just stay close to me, Lavina, for the next 45 minutes, because as you can see, I'm going to need it. So National Sorry Day, it first began on the 26th of May 1998. This year, National Sorry Day will be on this coming Sunday, but we've chosen to do it on Friday because it's obviously a day when we can get together and deliver the presentation. So it was first implemented to commemorate the first anniversary of the Bringing Them Home report that was tabled in Parliament a year prior to that. And if you want to know anything about the removal of children, the history behind that, and the intergenerational impacts on Aboriginal people who were removed, I strongly suggest that you look at that book, and or watch the DVD that is part of that. It's very informative, very educational, and well worth it if you want to know, particularly about intergenerational trauma as it relates to Aboriginal people. So the Bringing Them Home report was the final report from the National Inquiry into the removal of Aboriginal children from their families. Now, that doesn't give us any guide about what we do to commemorate Sorry Day, of course. That's up to us as individuals and organisations to do something about it. And I probably know that there are many organisations out there that are not doing anything, that may not even know that National Sorry Day is approaching. So I think it's really important that we've all come together, and it's really important that JCTS has put on this presentation today. And it's equally important that you all made the time to come along today. It's really important. So thank you to all of you, and thank you to JCTS for doing that. So I now want to talk about why Aboriginal children were removed from their families. Because we've had lots of sorry days, we've had lots of reconciliation events, but still there are many people who don't really understand why Aboriginal children were forcibly removed from their families. So I'm going to give you a bit of background to that. And it goes back a certain time. So in 1901, we had federation. So this was when the state governments came together and they said, we're going to form a federal Australian government. Now, one of the first policies that federal government did was establish and implement an Immigration Restriction Act. So many people today probably never heard of that act. It's probably more known today as a White Australia policy. Now, I want to point out here that all of us here who were in attendance today had nothing to do with that policy. However, it did happen, and it was in place for a long time, and it had a big impact on Aboriginal people generationally, and had a big impact on the issues that we are trying to close the gap on now. So that's what happened. That was the initial thinking behind it. But it's probably important to point out that children being removed and other such things happened before it became formal policy. So it was happening in an informal way for a time before that. So what they did is they said, okay, we want to achieve this White Australia policy. That's our aspiration. Let's do that. And then they realised that they had this problem. And they referred to this problem as a half-caste problem. And the reason for that was because this half-caste population was growing. So they needed to do something about it. So the approach that they took to this was involved two parts. One was to forcibly remove part Aboriginal children from their families and place them into institutions or place them with foster parents. The other approach that they took was that the full-blood Aborigines were going to remain on their reservations and they're going to die out peacefully. And it was through those two processes that they would achieve the white Australia that they set out to achieve. So a number of things happened from this that are still around today. The terminology, half-caste, quarter-caste, full-bloods, they have nothing to do with Aboriginal people, yet many people still describe Aboriginal people with these terms. These terms were placed on Aboriginal people. Aboriginal people didn't place them on themselves. They were placed on them as a way to know what to do with them. And we see that moreover with the terms Aboriginal and Indigenous. Those two terms have nothing to do with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, because those two terms were placed on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people by other people. And what we see today is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people reclaiming their Indigenous identity. And so we see that in a number of ways. So if you were to go to a conference, you might see a bio of the speaker. If you're reading a journal article, you might see information about the author, and it will say that John Smith, for example, is an Amudjara man from Central Australia. It may say that Sally Smith is a Alyawara woman from Tennant Creek. And of course, what they are not saying is that they are Aboriginal, because today it is important to them that they start to reclaim their Indigenous identity. So what we see happen is that when those terms Aboriginal and Indigenous were placed on people, it eliminated all of the cultural and linguistic diversity that really existed. So a lot of people sort of aren't aware of that, and they think that all people are Aboriginal people, but Aboriginal people have never been one group of people. So that's where those terms come from. What really happened here, and we should be at this point today in time to fully embrace the fact that this process was genocide. And that's according to international definitions of genocide, because it was an intentional attempt to separate people from transmitting their culture and their language. Now, one of the things I really want to point out here early, and it's not part of my script, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that, and again, we should all know this after many years of reconciliation, is that white Australians were absolutely crucial in supporting and advocating for Aboriginal people. So we all know the name Eddie Mabo. But do we know the names of his white Australian lawyers who represented him over such a long period? Do we know that the first Aboriginal medical service that was established in Redfern did not have a budget and relied on white health professionals to volunteer their time? We've probably all heard the song From Big Things Little Things Grow. Do we know that white Australians in the Union were absolutely crucial to assisting and advocating for Aboriginal people who went on strike for 7, 8 years. That they were crucial in supporting those people with water, clothes, food, medicine, and sharing their stories. All of that information is crucial, but we should all know that by now, after all these sorry days and all this reconciliation activity. So again, I want to point out that the removal of Aboriginal children from their families was genocide. None of us are responsible for it, but we should be able to accept it for what it is today. And I'll put Archie Roach here as my picture because Archie Roach himself was removed from his family, and his song, Took the Children Away, was a very important story for Aboriginal people. And I might take the opportunity to share my own personal story here. So my grandmother was removed from her mother, and then her children, including my mother, were taken from her. So my mother was given back to my grandmother when she was about 15. So in my family, it's only my generation who are not removed. Now you can't see that by looking at me, but again, I want to point out that these were institutions for half-caste children. And these children had their entire lives shaped by their Aboriginality, by the fact that they were labelled half-caste children. And that's really important to understand. And those intergenerational impacts are real, but often we cannot see them. But it still shaped all of their lives from when they were young kids all the way through till today. So I now want to talk about some of the myths that we use to justify, and I've said genocide there, but justify the removal of Aboriginal children. So this was a controlled narrative. So the narrative was, well, this is for their own good. And I'm sure you've all heard that. So that was a narrative that the government put together to get people on side, to get them to accept and understand what the government was trying to do. But it was incorrect. It was misleading. It wasn't for their own good. It was to commit genocide and achieve a white Australia policy. So this is not rocket science. What we need to understand is that you didn't need to remove these children from their mothers. All you needed to do is, if you were in government, was give them the same things that you gave to non-Aboriginal parents. Give them a house, give them welfare benefits if they're unemployed, give them employment, give them access to education and healthcare. That's the role of government. So people say today, well, if they didn't get removed, they would have been living in terrible conditions. All the government had to do was give them exactly the same services as they gave to non-Aboriginal people. So that is not rocket science, but that is part of the narrative that was established to get people to embrace the concept of removing children. Part of that narrative was to give them a better life as well. Well, they didn't have a better life. No kids have a better life when they're forcibly removed from their parents and raised in institutions and dormitories. No kids have a better life when they're not able to hug their mother. When they're, living in conditions that are really, really bad. And again, I'll refer you to the Bringing Them Home report to find out about that, okay? It's important that we just don't take people's word for things. We look up things and have a look at them. Again, to give them an education. Well, you didn't have to remove them. You could have given them an education if that's what you wanted to do. But again, the intent was to achieve a White Australia policy. Let me be very clear, it had nothing to do with doing what was best for them. And part of the whole narrative about the removal of children is the impact this has had on their parents. So it's, very rare to see the word parents in all the narrative around the removal of children. If we can just imagine the impact that it had on their lives, and then as these children grew older, one of the things that they have in their minds all the time is the impact it had on their parents. So there are a range of impacts that we often don't see. One of the myths that is that individual Australians are not to blame. Well, that's a construction because nobody is blaming individuals. Individual Australians don't develop policy. They don't develop policy frameworks. They don't develop resources to achieve those policies. So no one is blaming individuals. One of the other myths around this is that, well, and you hear this mentioned by university qualified people all around Australia, let me make that point, is that they say, well, this is in the past, can't we just move on? Again, these people have no understanding of the deep impacts of intergenerational trauma. I see Alex has got your hand up. Alex, have you got a question or
Hi,
something to?
Curtis. Yes,
Yeah.
I didn't want to interrupt, but I just wanted to let you know that your slides aren't changing.
No, that's I haven't changed slides yet.
You haven't? Okay,
No,
cool. That's all right.
that's okay. So I'm just talking about the myths and the control narrative that was used to justify the whole removal of Aboriginal children.
What slide do you see?
So I can see the myth slide. Can everybody see that?
We're still on the National Sorry Day slide, the first one.
That's all right. So we'll change that now, and I'll keep talking. So that's what happened. It was, this whole narrative was constructed and sold to the rest of the community as a way for them to jump on side and say, yes, it's for their own good. So that's what it was about, and it was misleading and it was incorrect because it wasn't for their own good at all. Governments could have just provided them with the same services that they provided other people. But getting back to the other point I was making here is that yes, people can say that, well, can't we just move on? But the intergenerational impacts are quite profound, and if we just move on, we're only embracing one view of history. So what happens when people say, well, why can't we just move on? They're saying that we don't want to hear this, and they're using that privilege to say, well, we want to say what we want to hear, and we don't want to hear what other people have got to say. So it's not being very inclusive of other people. It's disrespecting their histories. It's disrespecting the situations that they're in today, and it's not really part of being a multicultural society because we need to accept that people have different histories and that people have different realities today and different challenges. We can't just say, well, that upsets us, so let's not talk about that. That should be in the past, because all the intergenerational literature shows that no, it's not in the past, it's here and it's very real. And we need to address those issues together, not just think that it's in the past. So that's very important. So intergenerational issues become exacerbated when they're not treated. And a part of that treatment process is to acknowledge that it happened. And as I said, another part of the narrative, well, it's not a part of the narrative, it's been left out of the narrative, is the impact that child removal had on parents, because those parents suffered immensely as a result of that. So I'm going to move on now to a slide with the title Things to Consider. Can you see that? I'm so relieved because
We can
Lavina's
see
left the
it.
room. Here she comes now. So these are really important things to consider about it is the construction of Aboriginal identity. This is a construction that's been sold to us by people in power. So people in power have basically said what an Aboriginal person is and what they look like. And we see that all over the place, and we've seen that for generations. So that image is a person with a certain skin colour that is walking around in the bush, still has traditional culture and still has traditional language. And those people are part of Aboriginal society. Absolutely they are. But the question I want to pose today is, does this construction of Aboriginal identity align with the removal of half-caste children who are raised in half-caste institutions? So what that construction of Aboriginal identity does today is it misleads us to think that, well, if these people don't look that way, as per the construct that was sold to us, then they can't be really one of those people. And the history of child removal tells you that that is just not the case at all. As I said, these children were removed because they were labelled half-caste children. And the other point I want to make here is that these children who were removed, they were living with their Aboriginal mothers. They didn't know their other families. They were placed in institutions as young children, and then when they got older, their children were removed from them. So their whole lives were, impacted by the fact that they were Aboriginal people. And oftentimes we lose sight of that because of this construction of Aboriginality. And that construction of Aboriginality then goes into, well, Aboriginal disadvantage. And so the intergenerational impacts on people, the fact that people cannot speak their traditional languages, etc., they're all part of the intergenerational trauma that the Aboriginal people, who we often don't see as real Aborigines, live with on a daily basis. The other thing to consider is that the children of children who were removed have often become successful. However, they still suffer, often in silence, because people cannot see their suffering. And it's one of those things, people don't raise these issues with others. They don't want to talk about it because people don't want to hear about it. So it's a bit like racism, this term racism, yeah? Like probably caught your attention there. We don't talk about it. No one wants to hear about it. And people who live with it, contrary to popular views, they don't go off and cry racism all the time. They know that nobody wants to hear about it. And they know that they're seen as a problem if they talk about it. So it's a similar sort of thing there. And people know that it's something that people often don't want to talk about. And that's largely due to the myths in that narrative, which has become entrenched in our society, despite it being wrong. So when things become entrenched, even if they're wrong, they're hard to shake. So often the Aboriginal families that were severely impacted by the removal of children don't talk about their histories because they live with them every day. They know who they are, they know their family experience, and they feel pain and embarrassment when they've got to talk about them. It's really important to understand that one of the intentions of the colonisation process was for Aboriginal people to experience internalised racism. So the colonisation process was not about just saying, okay, we're going to move you over there where we take this area of land. As we see with the removal of children, it was about getting into their heads and saying that you need to be like us because your people are inferior. And so internalised racism was part of the colonisation process. And there were people who were removed who fully embraced the concept that their people were inferior, that their mothers did not want them. Their mothers didn't have any choice in it. There are people out there who say, well, it was for their own good. That's part of the colonisation process, to get people to think that way. So what happens when we get upset about hearing this history? Well, as I said earlier, when we get upset about hearing this history, we use our privilege to deny other perspectives. And I've seen this happen many times today, where people, they get upset when these things are spoken about because it's not part of the history that they want to hear about. And all that does is deny other people their history, which they're trying to share with other people. That's all that does. It just reinforces, the notion of privilege, and to say, well, we don't want to hear about it, so why should we have to hear about it? And it's really important that we're able to hear those other perspectives, because they happened, and it's really important in the context of reconciliation and in the context of race relations in Australia. So I'm going to go on to the next slide now, with the help of Lavina. So Sorry Day, it gives us an opportunity to hear about, the really important work that white Australians have done in advocating for Aboriginal people. Reconciliation allows us to do that. There are still many white Australians out there who are doing fantastic work for Aboriginal people. It's an opportunity to acknowledge that, which is so important for us, and it's so important for Aboriginal people to hear those stories as well. But they're probably things that relate more to the reconciliation activities that we should be having. But National Sorry Day is important because it allows us to hear, people's history, and history that wasn't so long ago. And again, as I point out, if we shouldn't get upset and feel guilty about things, because it just denies people their history. Sorry Day is important because we cannot deny it. It happened. Sorry Day allows us to get a better understanding of intergenerational trauma. It allows us to have a better insight into this constructed image of what Aboriginal people look like. And that is still prevalent. And we cannot understand Aboriginal people or race relations without understanding this, again, recent history. And it's really important in the spirit of reconciliation. Sorry Day is about us, listening to people, hearing stories, and doing something that educates people. And it's really important that Sorry Day, similar to reconciliation, is not just left to Aboriginal people to organise events and to do the speaking, because Sorry Day is really about all of us coming together and learning, as is our reconciliation. So I'm going to go on to the next slide, and this is a question slide. So I believe Alex has been fielding questions or the Q&A stuff. So if you have any, please feel free to ask through the chat.
Yep, there's more comments and questions in there at the moment, Curtis. We've had Tracy sharing the Bringing Them Home report.
Yep.
Which is really useful. And Josie has shared a personal story on there as well.
Okay, good. If anybody does have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat thing to Alex.
We've got a question here from Bronwyn.
Yep.
She's asked, what are your thoughts about the new stolen generation and high rates of removal today?
Again, this is not new. We're looking at the outcome of wicked policy problems that haven't been given the appropriate response for many years. If housing's still a problem, if health is still a problem, what's been invested in them is important. So we really need to work with Aboriginal people to make sure that we're addressing these issues in the first place before they get to that point.
She's got a follow-up question for that.
Yep.
And the role of GPs in addressing the Close the Gap to reduce removal of children today.
Attending sessions such as this, I'm not a medical educator, but I'll tell you that it's really important that GPs listen to these perspectives and that they're provided with practical advice around how to apply cultural safety and so forth, and that they, continue to work with Aboriginal people. And working cross-culturally is challenging. There's no, silver bullet to it, but that they, persevere and continue to do the work that they are doing already, which is, making a massive contribution as it is.
No further questions in there, Curtis.
Thank you, everybody, for your time, and I hope you got something from today's session.
Thank you.
Thank you.